There is a ritual that plays out in hundreds of millions of homes every single morning. The alarm goes off, the eyes open, and before anything else, before breakfast, before water, sometimes before even fully waking up, the coffee is started. It is one of the most deeply embedded habits in modern life, and for most people, it never occurs to question it. Coffee in the morning feels natural. It feels necessary. It feels like the most logical thing a human being can do in the first 10 minutes of the day. But what is actually happening inside your body during those minutes, in the gut, in the brain, in the adrenal glands, in the blood, is a story that most coffee drinkers have never heard. And it is a story that changes the way you think about the single most common morning habit on the planet. Because drinking coffee on an empty stomach is not just drinking coffee. It is introducing one of the most pharmacologically active substances humans consume daily into a body that has just spent 8 hours in a fasted, hormonally primed, neurochemically sensitive state. The coffee does not arrive in a neutral environment. It arrives in a body that is in the middle of a very specific and very delicate biological transition. And understanding what that transition is and what coffee does to interrupt or accelerate it is the key to understanding why so many people who drink coffee first thing in the morning feel anxious, jittery, and strangely hollow even after the energy hit arrives, and why others feel fine, and what is actually happening beneath the surface regardless of how you feel. Let us start where the story actually starts, which is not when you pour the coffee, but several hours before, while you are still asleep. In the final hours of sleep, typically between 5 and 8 in the morning, depending on your schedule, your body initiates a carefully orchestrated hormonal sequence designed to prepare you for waking. The centerpiece of this sequence is cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone produced by the adrenal glands that most people associate with stress, and while it does play a central role in the stress response, its primary biological function is far broader than that. Cortisol is fundamentally a mobilization hormone. It raises blood sugar by signaling the liver to release stored glucose. It increases alertness and blood pressure. It prepares your muscles and your brain for the demands of an active day. It is, in the most basic sense, your body's built-in waking mechanism.
The surge of cortisol that occurs in the morning, known as the cortisol awakening response, peaks roughly 30 to 45 minutes after you open your eyes. This peak is not a stress response, it is a performance response. It is your body doing everything it can to get you alert, energized, and ready to function without any external assistance. In other words, during that 30 to 45-minute window after waking, your body is already producing its own powerful stimulant, and it is doing so in a precise, calibrated, biologically intelligent way. Now, consider what happens when coffee enters the picture during this window. Caffeine, the primary active compound in coffee, works by blocking adenosine receptors in the brain. Adenosine is a molecule that accumulates during waking hours and progressively makes you feel sleepy the longer you have been awake. By the time you wake up in the morning, adenosine has been mostly cleared during sleep, which is part of why you feel most alert in the first hours of the day. Caffeine does not generate energy directly. It blocks the signal that would eventually slow you down. It is less like fuel and more like removing the speed limiter from an engine that is already running. When you drink coffee during your cortisol peak, you are stacking a powerful adenosine blocker on top of a body that is already flooded with a natural stimulant hormone. The result is often not better alertness, it is overstimulation. The nervous system is pushed past the level of arousal it needs into a state of heightened, sometimes anxious activation. This is the neurological explanation for why so many people describe feeling wired but not focused after early morning coffee. Not energized in a clean, productive way, but buzzing, slightly on edge, and paradoxically less capable of the calm, sustained attention they were hoping caffeine would provide. There is also a hormonal consequence that extends well beyond the morning. When caffeine arrives during the cortisol peak, The body perceives the additional stimulation as a signal to produce even more cortisol than it was already generating. Studies have confirmed that caffeine consumption significantly elevates cortisol levels, and this effect is most pronounced when caffeine is consumed in the morning. Over time, with this pattern repeated every day, the adrenal glands become habituated to producing elevated cortisol in response to caffeine. The cortisol awakening response itself can become blunted. The body, accustomed to receiving artificial stimulation at the same time every morning, begins to reduce its own natural cortisol production in compensation. The result is a feedback loop that most people never connect to their coffee habit. They notice that they cannot function without coffee in the morning. They assume this is simply who they are. What has actually happened is that their body has outsourced its natural waking mechanism to caffeine and has quietly down-regulated its own capacity to wake itself up. The dependency is not just psychological, it is physiological. And it begins in large part because of when the coffee arrives, not just that it arrives. Now let us move into the gut, because what coffee does to the digestive system on an empty stomach is one of the most important and most overlooked parts of this conversation. Coffee is one of the most chemically complex beverages humans consume. It contains over 1,000 distinct compounds, many of which are biologically active. Among these are various acids, including chlorogenic acids and quinic acid, that have direct and measurable effects on the stomach lining. When you drink coffee on an empty stomach, these acids come into contact with a gastric environment that is already naturally acidic, and they stimulate the production of even more gastric acid. The stomach, finding itself flooded with acid and lacking any food to direct that acid toward, turns that corrosive environment on itself. The mucous membrane that lines the stomach and protects it from its own acid is not infinitely resilient. With repeated exposure to high acid conditions without the buffer of food, this lining can become irritated, inflamed, and, over time, gradually eroded. This is the mechanism behind the gastritis, the acid reflux, the persistent nausea, and the general stomach discomfort that many habitual empty-stomach coffee drinkers experience and often dismiss as just how their stomach works. It is not just how their stomach works. It is a predictable consequence of repeatedly introducing a highly acidic, acid-stimulating substance into an unprotected digestive environment. Coffee also stimulates the production of a hormone called gastrin, which signals the stomach to produce more acid, and a compound called cholecystokinin, which triggers the gallbladder to release bile. In the context of a meal, these responses are helpful. They prepare the digestive system to break down food efficiently. On an empty stomach, they create an environment of digestive activation with nothing to digest. The system is geared up and ready, but there is no substrate for it to work on. The result is often cramping, urgency, and the familiar rush to the bathroom that many coffee drinkers experience shortly after their first cup. This is not a sign of a healthy digestive system responding normally. It is a sign of a digestive system being artificially accelerated before it is ready. Beyond the stomach, coffee on an empty stomach has measurable effects on blood sugar that run counter to what most people would expect. The cortisol spike, amplified by early caffeine consumption, signals the liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream. At the same time, caffeine has been shown to reduce insulin sensitivity in the short term, meaning the cells become temporarily less efficient at absorbing that glucose. The result is a rise in blood sugar in the absence of any food intake. For healthy individuals, this rise is typically modest and temporary, but the consequence is a blood sugar arc that peaks and then drops, and that drop, occurring an hour or two after the morning coffee, is often what drives the mid-morning hunger, the craving for something sweet, and the energy dip that people then try to address with a second cup of coffee. The cycle is self-reinforcing, and it begins with the blood sugar manipulation that happens when caffeine meets an empty stomach and elevated cortisol simultaneously.
Now let us talk about what happens to the brain in more detail, because this is where the empty stomach variable becomes particularly consequential. When you wake up after a night of sleep, your blood sugar is naturally at a lower point than it will be for most of the day. Your brain, which depends almost exclusively on glucose for fuel, is operating on relatively limited reserves. Normally, breakfast begins to restore those reserves, providing the glucose that supports focused thought, working memory, emotional regulation, and decision-making. When you skip food and go straight to coffee, the brain receives a powerful neurological stimulant without the fuel it needs to properly support the cognitive functions that stimulant is supposed to enhance. This is why the experience of empty stomach coffee so often has a particular quality to it. There is arousal without clarity. There is activation without stability. The caffeine has turned up the volume on the nervous system, but the substrate needed to convert that arousal into actual productive cognitive function is missing. People feel alert but scattered, energized but irritable, capable of motion but not necessarily of sustained deep work. This is not how caffeine is supposed to feel, and it is not how caffeine feels when it is consumed with food in the system. The food does not blunt the caffeine. It provides the neurological foundation that allows the caffeine to do what it is actually good at, which is extending focus and delaying fatigue in a brain that already has what it needs to function. The anxiety connection is worth examining carefully here, because it is one of the most commonly reported experiences of empty stomach coffee drinkers, and one of the most misunderstood. Caffeine on an empty stomach raises cortisol, elevates adrenaline, increases heart rate, tightens blood vessels, and activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight-or-flight branch of the autonomic nervous system. All of these effects are amplified when there is no food in the system to moderate the absorption and metabolic processing of caffeine. The result is a physiological state that is chemically nearly identical to mild anxiety: elevated heart rate, slight muscle tension, a sense of alertness edged with unease, and in sensitive individuals, full-blown anxiety symptoms, including racing thoughts, a tight chest, and the feeling that something is wrong without any identifiable reason. Many people who describe themselves as anxious in the mornings have never considered that their morning coffee ritual, consumed before any food, might be the primary driver of that anxiety. It is not that they are anxious people who happen to drink coffee. In many cases, the empty stomach coffee is producing the anxiety biochemically, and the anxiety is then interpreted as a personality trait or a mood disorder rather than a predictable physiological response to a habit. Let us now consider what begins to change when you shift this single variable, not necessarily giving up coffee entirely, but simply eating something before you drink it, or waiting until the cortisol peak has passed, typically 60 to 90 minutes after waking, before having your first cup. The changes are often faster and more noticeable than people expect. Within the first few days of drinking coffee after food rather than before, most people notice a change in the quality of the caffeine effect. The edge softens. The jitteriness decreases or disappears. The energy feels more usable, more directed, more like actual alertness and less like overstimulation. This is because food in the stomach slows the absorption of caffeine, creating a more gradual rise in blood caffeine levels rather than a sharp spike. The peak effect is slightly lower, but significantly more sustained. The crash that follows is less pronounced. The anxiety that accompanied the morning cup often diminishes substantially or vanishes. The gut also responds within days. Stomach discomfort, the acid sensitivity, the urgent trips to the bathroom, the bloating that many people accepted as their normal digestive experience begin to ease. The stomach lining, no longer being bathed in acid without a food buffer, begins to recover. The inflammatory response in the gastric mucosa, which in chronic cases of empty stomach coffee consumption can become persistently elevated, begins to settle. For people who have lived with vague morning stomach discomfort for years and assumed it was simply how their digestion worked, this shift can feel almost disorienting in how significant it is. Over 2 to 3 weeks of waiting to drink coffee until after eating, the cortisol rhythm begins to recalibrate. The natural cortisol awakening response, which had been repeatedly overwhelmed and eventually partially suppressed by the daily caffeine injection during its peak, begins to reassert itself. People start noticing that they feel more naturally alert in the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, before the coffee arrives. This is their cortisol awakening response functioning the way it was designed to. The body is remembering how to wake itself up. And when coffee does arrive, after the natural cortisol peak has passed and levels are beginning to decline, the timing is now working with the body's biology rather than against it. Caffeine is most effective not when cortisol is high, but when cortisol is dropping and adenosine is beginning to accumulate. That window, roughly 90 minutes to 2 hours after waking, is when the pharmacological action of caffeine aligns most intelligently with the body's natural energy curve. Insulin sensitivity, which is temporarily impaired by empty stomach caffeine consumption, also begins to normalize when coffee is consumed after food. Blood sugar regulation through the morning becomes more stable. The mid-morning energy crash becomes less severe or disappears entirely. The craving for sugar that so often accompanies the post-coffee drop in blood glucose resolves. Appetite signals become more coherent and more accurately timed to actual caloric need, rather than being distorted by blood sugar swings driven by caffeine-cortisol interactions.
There is also something worth considering about what coffee does to the absorption of certain nutrients, specifically when consumed around mealtimes. Coffee contains compounds called polyphenols and tannins that bind to minerals, including iron and zinc, and reduce how efficiently the intestines absorb them. On an empty stomach, where the coffee sits without competition from other foods, this binding effect is more pronounced. For people who are already at risk for iron deficiency, habitual empty stomach coffee consumption may be quietly contributing to the problem in ways that neither they nor their doctors have considered. Waiting even 30 to 60 minutes after eating before having coffee substantially reduces this interference with mineral absorption. By the end of a month of changed timing, the overall picture is one of a system recalibrated. The adrenal glands are cycling through their cortisol rhythm more naturally. The gut is healthier and less reactive. Blood sugar is more stable through the morning. Anxiety that was attributed to personality is reduced or gone. The coffee itself, consumed at the right time and in the right context, works better, providing cleaner, more sustained, more functionally useful energy than it did when it was the first thing entering an empty body. Coffee is genuinely one of the most studied substances in the human diet. The research on its long-term health benefits is substantial, including associations with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, certain liver conditions, and even some cancers. The coffee itself is not the enemy in this story. The timing is. The habit of consuming it before anything else, on a fasted stomach flooded with morning cortisol, in a body that has not yet been given the fuel or the digestive foundation to process it properly, is the specific combination that creates the problems. The cup of coffee itself is not the issue. It is the empty space around it that changes everything. Your morning ritual does not need to be dismantled. It just needs to be reordered. Eat something first. Let your body wake up on its own terms for a few minutes, and then, when the coffee arrives, it will land in an environment that is ready for it, in a body that can use it properly, in a brain that has what it needs to turn that caffeine into something that actually feels like what you were always hoping it would feel like. That is the version of your morning that your biology has been trying to offer you all along. It has just been waiting for the right sequence.